Racist officer assaults Black U.S. Army general and faces immediate consequences. Welcome to a story filled with emotion and powerful moments. Join us as we follow the journey of a hero returning from battle, only to face an even greater challenge in his own homeland. Will justice truly be served? Stay with us to find out. General David Walker was exhausted. His body ached from the rigors of a military career that had taken him to some of the world's most hostile environments. Yet, despite the fatigue that settled deep into his bones, his mind was sharp, buzzing with the anticipation of being home. After 2 years of commanding overseas operations, a task that had not only tested his strategic intellect, but also his resilience as a leader, the thought of returning to the familiar streets of his hometown brought a strange sense of calm. Tonight, the weight of the world. It was late, well past sundown, and the streets of his quiet suburban neighborhood were bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The darkened sky was a deep navy blue, a stark contrast to the harsh sun that had beaten down on him during his years in the Middle East. The tranquility of home, with its tree-lined streets and well-kept homes, felt like a balm to his soul. He had spent years making life-and-death decisions in the chaos of war zones. But here, in this small town, life felt simple. David loved this town. It wasn't the bustling energy of a big city with its crowds and noise. It was a place that seemed to exist in a painting, almost untouched by time. A place where bicycles were left on the curb, where neighbors waved hello, and where the air smelled of pine trees and fresh-cut grass. To the outside world, it was just an ordinary small American town. But to David, it was home. It was where he could finally. His wife, Sarah, had sent him a message earlier that day, reminding him to pick up a few groceries on his way home. Such a simple task, buying milk, eggs, and bread, felt almost surreal after months of military protocols, briefings, and the ever-present tension of life in a war zone. As he drove down Main Street, passing the local diner, the hardware store, and the small church at the corner, he couldn't help but smile at how much he had missed the mundanity of it all. The normalcy was grounding. As David neared the grocery store at the edge of town, he felt a small sense of peace wash over him. The store was nearly empty at this hour, and the neon sign buzzed quietly against the night. He pulled into the parking lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel lightly as he rolled down the window to let the cool night air in. The smell of damp earth and pine trees filled the car. For the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to fully relax. Inside the store, the familiar sterile brightness and soft hum of the fluorescent lights felt almost comforting. David grabbed a cart and moved through the aisles with ease, his military training showing even here. Milk, eggs, bread, fresh fruit. He moved swiftly, methodically, just as he had done during so many supply runs overseas. As he approached the checkout counter, the young cashier, who looked barely old enough to be out of high school, greeted him with a polite, tired smile. David nodded in return, swiped his card, and gathered his bags, loading the groceries into the back seat of his car. He couldn't help but think of his wife waiting for him at home. Her smile, warm and welcoming, was a beacon after so long away. And his children, 2 teenagers now, would be excited to have him back, even if they were too old to show it the way they once had. He could already imagine their laughter filling the house as they sat around the kitchen table, sharing stories and catching up on lost time. It was moments like these that made all the sacrifices he had made worthwhile. As he started the car and pulled back onto the road, his thoughts drifted to the weekend ahead. Family time, barbecues, maybe a trip to the lake. A welcome change from the high-stakes decisions that had consumed his life for so long. He smiled to himself, feeling lighter than he had in years. But that peace was short-lived. Glancing into his rearview mirror, David noticed headlights approaching from behind. At first, he thought nothing of it. Cars passed through the area occasionally, even at this late hour. But this one stayed behind him, too close for comfort. His training kicked in, and his body tensed slightly. It was a police car, unmistakable even in the dim light. The lights on top flashed red and blue, illuminating the darkened street behind him. David's heart sank. He slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road, his mind racing through the usual steps. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a stop sign or broken any traffic laws. Perhaps it was just a routine stop, something minor. As a man of discipline and respect, he had always been careful to follow the rules, both on and off the battlefield. But still, as the police car rolled to a stop behind him, a flicker of unease crept into his thoughts. The officer approached the window with a purposeful stride, his silhouette growing larger in the side mirror. David rolled down the window, his hands on the steering wheel, palms up, a gesture of compliance drilled into him during his years of service. "Stay calm," he told himself. He had nothing to hide. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone sharp and commanding. David handed over his documents without hesitation, speaking evenly. "Here you go, officer. I'm General David Walker, U.S. Army." The officer, whose name tag read Officer Winters, barely glanced at the documents before his expression hardened. There was something in his eyes, an aggression, a simmering contempt that set David's nerves on edge. Without another word, Winters ordered him out of the vehicle, his hand hovering too close to the holster on his hip. Confusion flashed through David's mind. He had done nothing wrong. His military discipline kept him composed. But the situation was escalating too quickly, spiraling out of control before he could make sense of it. He stepped out of the car, his hands raised slightly to show he was no threat. But it didn't matter. Winters grabbed him forcefully, slamming him against the hood of the car with a roughness that shocked him. The world around him seemed to blur. The cold metal of the cars had pressed against his chest, and the sound of his own breath filled his ears. David felt the cold metal of the car's hood beneath him, the suddenness of the officer's actions leaving him stunned. His military training, the years of discipline and composure in high-stress situations, were the only things keeping him calm as his mind raced to comprehend what was happening. This wasn't the battlefield where you expected sudden aggression. This was his hometown, a place where people knew each other, where he had been raised, and where he had once imagined raising his children in peace. Yet, here he was, treated as if he were some dangerous criminal. The absurdity of it made his head spin. "Stay still," Officer Winters ordered, his voice full of authority but devoid of any humanity. His hand gripped David's arm harshly, pushing him harder against the car. "You're under arrest for resisting." Resisting? David's voice was low, calm, but inside, a storm was beginning to brew. He hadn't even had a chance to resist anything. He had complied with everything asked of him, and yet here he was, treated like an immediate threat. But even as his anger began to simmer, his military discipline kept him steady. He knew that any sudden movements, any show of frustration, could escalate the situation further. This wasn't the time to act on emotion. He needed to keep control of the situation, if only for his safety. From the corner of his eye, David noticed a small group of people gathering on the sidewalk. Some were holding up their phones, recording the incident. He could see the look on their faces. Some were shocked. Others were angry. But no one stepped in. No one questioned what was happening. He could hear the murmurs, feel the weight of their stares. And in that moment, he understood the full gravity of the situation. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was humiliation. And it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about what he represented. A black man in America, even one who had served his country, was still subject to suspicion, to fear, to the assumption of guilt. The handcuffs clicked into place with a finality that made David's heart sink. The cold steel bit into his wrists as Officer Winters yanked his arms behind him with unnecessary force. David's breathing became measured as he worked to keep himself calm. The last thing he needed was to give Winters any reason to further escalate the situation. "Officer, there's been a misunderstanding," David said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "I've done nothing wrong. You have my identification. I'm General David Walker. I've served this country for over 20 years. This can't be happening." But Winters wasn't listening. He wasn't interested in explanations or apologies. His focus remained singular, as if detaining David was the only objective that mattered. The officer's face was hard, devoid of empathy, as he shoved David into a standing position and began leading him toward the police car. As they passed the growing crowd, David heard a voice from the sidewalk. "That's General David Walker." A middle-aged man in a baseball cap was yelling, clearly frustrated by what he was witnessing. "He's a war hero. What the hell are you doing?" The words seemed to hang in the air, but they did nothing to soften Winter's resolve. He continued to manhandle David toward the squad car, ignoring the shouts from the bystanders, who were now recording everything with fervor. David's jaw clenched as he felt the shame of the moment wash over him. Here he was, a decorated general who had commanded troops in war zones, now reduced to being another nameless, faceless suspect under the harsh gaze of a police officer who didn't care about his story or his service. It wasn't about who he was, it was about what he looked like. That was all that mattered in this moment. As Winters pushed David against the side of the police car, the situation took an unexpected turn. Another squad car pulled up behind Winters' vehicle, its siren briefly flashing before being shut off. Out stepped a petite woman in her late 30s, her short hair pulled back neatly, her uniform crisp and clean. Officer Jennifer Hayes approached quickly, her eyes scanning the scene as she tried to assess what was happening. "Winters, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice professional but tinged with urgency. There was something in the air that told her this situation wasn't as simple as it appeared. "He's resisting arrest," Winters barked, his tone full of authority. "I pulled him over, and he wouldn't cooperate." Officer Hayes frowned, her eyes shifting from Winters to David, and something in her expression softened. Her mind worked quickly, trying to place the man standing in handcuffs before her. She had seen his face before, on TV, in the news, and then it clicked. "Wait," Hayes said slowly, her eyes widening in recognition. "General David Walker?" David turned his head slightly, locking eyes with her. "Yes," he replied, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of the situation. For a moment, Winters froze, the full realization hitting him like a wave. He had heard the name before, but in his haste, in his need to assert authority, it hadn't registered. General Walker, a decorated U.S. Army general, a man who had given decades of his life in service to his country. The color drained from Winters' face as the enormity of what he had just done settled in. He had aggressively detained a man of immense respect and status, and it was all playing out in front of witnesses who were documenting every second of it. "General?" Winters stammered, his bravado crumbling as he took a small step backward. His hands trembled slightly as he loosened his grip on David's arm. The crowd began murmuring louder now, their anger rising as they realized what was happening. Some were shouting at Winters. Others continued recording the scene, their phones raised high. But all eyes were now on the officer who had just made what was likely the biggest mistake of his career. Officer Hayes stepped between Winters and David, her voice firm. "Winters, back off. Right now." Winters stood frozen, his face pale and his posture rigid, as if distancing himself from the situation might somehow undo what had already been done. But it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no turning back. David stood silently, though his anger simmered just beneath the surface. He had faced worse situations in his life: war, loss, life or death decisions, but this felt different. This felt deeply personal, and it cut to the core. He had spent his life earning the respect of his peers, his soldiers, and his country. And yet, here he was, reduced to a suspect in his own hometown, treated with disdain for no reason other than the color of his skin. "I didn't know," Winters muttered weakly, his voice barely audible as he tried to comprehend the gravity of his actions. But his words did nothing to change the reality unfolding around him. Officer Hayes, now fully in control of the situation, quickly uncuffed David and offered a brief apology, her tone professional but filled with regret. "General Walker, I'm deeply sorry for what's happened here. We'll get this sorted out." David nodded, rubbing his wrists where the metal cuffs had bitten into his skin. His expression remained calm, but there was a weight in his eyes that spoke of years of experience and the quiet dignity that only comes from having faced unimaginable adversity. He had been through wars. But this battle was different. This was a battle for dignity, for justice, for respect that should have never been questioned in the first place. The crowd continued to gather, their voices growing louder as they demanded accountability. For David, this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the system that allowed this kind of injustice to happen. Over and over again. It was about the countless black men and women who had experienced similar humiliations, who had been treated as guilty until proven innocent. This, David knew, was a battle that had been fought for far too long, and it wasn't one he could walk away from. Officer Winters stood there, hands trembling slightly as he backed away from General David Walker. The weight of his mistake was slowly crashing down on him like a tidal wave, threatening to drown him in regret and shame. He had detained a man whose name was revered across the country, a man who had fought for the very freedoms Winters had sworn to protect. And yet, Winters had made a snap decision, driven by an instinctive bias that he could no longer deny. David Walker didn't move right away after Officer Hayes had removed the handcuffs. Instead, he stood still, breathing deeply as he rubbed his wrists. The crowd surrounding them had grown larger, and their murmurs of disbelief had shifted into angry shouts. Some people were calling for justice, others simply documenting the entire event with their phones. Each face that David glimpsed reflected the same mix of outrage and frustration, a collective anger that stemmed from far too many incidents like this one. The irony wasn't lost on David. Here he was, a man who had served his country, protected it from threats foreign and domestic. Now, standing on the same soil he had fought for, treated as though he were a criminal. But this moment wasn't about the uniform he had worn or the medals he had earned. It was about what it meant to be black in America. He had known that truth all too well, but experiencing it firsthand, in this way, felt like a fresh wound, a reminder of the systemic problems that persisted. Officer Jennifer Hayes, sensing the escalating tension in the crowd, stepped forward and addressed David directly. General Walker, again, I deeply apologize for this. I'll make sure the appropriate actions are taken. David looked at her, his eyes reflecting the calm of a man who had learned to control his emotions. Even in the face of immense pressure, he gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement, but remained silent. Words, in this moment, felt almost unnecessary. The reality of what had happened was already clear. As Officer Hayes turned to Winters, her tone sharpened. Officer Winters, we need to talk. Winters swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He could feel the eyes of the crowd burning into him, their disdain palpable. The humiliation was unbearable, but the shame that gnawed at him was worse. His whole career, he had prided himself on being a good cop, on doing the right thing, and yet, here he was, the villain in a story he hadn't even realized he was writing. I didn't know, Winters stammered, but the words felt hollow, even to him. The excuse, flimsy and weak, couldn't stand up to the reality of what had happened. You didn't know? Hayes repeated, her voice icy with disbelief. You didn't know you were handcuffing one of the most decorated military generals in this country? I didn't know he was, Winters started, but Hayes cut him off. That's not the point, she snapped. It doesn't matter who he is. Winters, this could have been anyone. You're supposed to protect people, not treat them like they're guilty before you even know their name. Winters flinched at her words, each one a blow to the facade he had built around himself. He had always believed in the badge, in the power it gave him to keep people safe. But now, as he stood there, the badge felt like a burden, a symbol of authority he had abused. He had made assumptions, had acted on those assumptions, and now he was paying the price for it. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Hayes knew she needed to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled out of control. She turned toward the bystanders, raising her hands in a gesture of calm. Everyone, please, we're going to handle this. Please disperse. But the crowd wasn't satisfied with her reassurances. Their anger had already been ignited, and now it was a flame that refused to be extinguished. One man, his face flushed with anger, shouted, "Handle it? This is what we're talking about. This is why we march. This is why we protest." David, still standing next to the squad car, could feel the tension rising like a heavy fog. He knew that moments like these could quickly turn volatile, and he didn't want this situation to spiral into something far worse. He had been in enough life-threatening situations to understand that when emotions were high, things could escalate in an instant. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "I appreciate your concern," he said, addressing the crowd. "But this isn't the way. We don't need this to become something else." His words seemed to have a calming effect, at least on some. The shouting began to subside, but the undercurrent of anger was still very much alive. People weren't just angry for him. They were angry for every injustice that had gone unnoticed, for every life that had been disrupted or destroyed because of a system that failed to see them as equals. David turned back to Officer Hayes, who was clearly trying to keep control of the situation. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice steady. Hayes hesitated for a moment, glancing at Winters, who stood a few feet away, looking more lost than ever. "I'll be reporting this to my superior," she said. "There will be an investigation into Officer Winters' conduct." David gave a slight nod. He had heard promises like this before, had seen too many instances where investigations led to nothing, where accountability was just a word used to placate the public. But something in Officer Hayes' demeanor told him she was serious. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. "Not this time. Please make sure that happens," David said, his tone carrying the weight of experience. He wasn't just speaking for himself, he was speaking for everyone who had been mistreated, for everyone who hadn't had the platform or the voice to demand justice. "I will," Hayes replied, her expression resolute. "I promise you that." As the tension in the air began to dissipate slightly, David could feel the weight of the night's events settling over him. This wasn't over. Not for him. Not for Officer Winters. And certainly not for the people who had witnessed the scene unfold. The incident would be talked about, shared, and analyzed. It would become part of a larger narrative, one that had been written long before tonight, but would continue to be written until real change happened. Officer Winters stood to the side, his head bowed, his face pale. The crowd's attention had shifted away from him, but he knew that didn't matter. His mistake would follow him now. It would become the defining moment of his career, of his life. Even, and as much as he wanted to believe that it could be undone, that somehow he could make amends, he knew the truth. This wasn't something that could be easily forgiven. David, sensing that the situation was coming to an end, turned toward the street where his car was parked. He took a deep breath, the night air filling his lungs as he tried to push away the anger that still simmered inside him. He had come home looking for peace, for a quiet return to normalcy. But that was not the world he lived in, not yet. As he opened the door to his car, he heard one final shout from the crowd, a voice filled with both frustration and hope. "We're with you, General Walker. We got your back." David paused for a moment, his hand resting on the car door. He turned slightly and gave the crowd a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He drove away slowly, the events of the night replaying in his mind. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. This was about something bigger, something that had been happening for far too long. And now, with the eyes of the world watching, he knew that the fight for justice had only just begun. As David Walker drove away from the scene, the quiet hum of the car engine was a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just moments before. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale against the dark interior. The night stretched out before him, the familiar streets of his hometown now carrying the weight of something far heavier than he'd anticipated. It wasn't just the sting of being treated like a criminal, despite everything he had accomplished in his life. It was the collective experience of millions of others who had been mistreated, misjudged, and disrespected because of the color of their skin. David had faced challenges before, on the battlefield, in negotiations, in leadership roles that had tested his strength and resolve. But this fight, this struggle for equality and dignity at home, felt even more daunting. His mind raced as he thought about what had just happened, how quickly things had escalated, how, in the blink of an eye, a peaceful evening could turn into a situation that threatened his dignity, his humanity. No matter how many titles or honors a person held, no matter how respected they were. None of that seemed to matter when prejudice came into play. David turned onto a quieter street, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. His house was only a few minutes away, but it felt like he was driving through a different world. Everything around him, the trees, the houses, the neatly trimmed lawns, seemed surreal, almost disconnected from the turmoil he had just experienced. As he pulled into his driveway, the weight of the night pressed down on him even harder. He sat there for a moment, the car idling in the stillness of the suburban neighborhood. Cynthia's car was parked in its usual spot, and the lights inside their home were still on, waiting for his return. Normally, this sight would have brought him a sense of comfort. But tonight, it only deepened the ache in his chest. David finally turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, grabbing the grocery bags from the back seat. The normalcy of the task, picking up milk, eggs, and bread, felt jarring after what he had just been through. He walked up the front steps, his mind still racing, and opened the door. Inside, the warmth of the house embraced him, the soft scent of lavender filling the air. Cynthia had always loved using essential oils to create a calm, inviting atmosphere. Normally, it worked, but tonight, even the soothing scent couldn't ease the tension knotted in his muscles. Cynthia appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes widening in concern the moment she saw him. She rushed down, her bare feet padding softly against the wooden steps. "David," she said, her voice laced with worry. "What happened?" For a moment, David couldn't find the words. He stood there, grocery bags in hand, looking at the woman he loved, the woman who had stood by him through the hardest moments of his life. And yet, how could he explain this? How could he make sense of the senseless? "I was pulled over," he finally said, his voice quiet but heavy with emotion, "by a cop who assumed I was a criminal." Cynthia's face paled, her eyes widening even further. She took the bags from him, setting them on the floor as she stepped closer, her hand reaching for his. "David, what do you mean? What happened? Are you okay?" David nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure if okay was the right word for what he felt. He wasn't physically harmed, but the emotional and psychological toll was harder to describe. "I'm fine," he said, his voice still subdued. But it was close, too close. Cynthia led him to the living room, guiding him gently to the couch. She sat beside him, her hand never leaving his, as though afraid he might slip away. "Tell me everything," she whispered. And so, he did. He told her about the cop, Officer Winters, and how the situation had escalated so quickly, how the crowd had gathered, how Officer Hayes had intervened, how he had been handcuffed, treated as if his years of service to the country meant nothing. Cynthia listened, her face a mask of anger and disbelief, her grip on his hand tightening with each new detail. When David finished, the silence between them was thick with shared pain and frustration. Cynthia shook her head, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I can't believe this," she said softly. "After everything you've done, after everything you've been through, this is how you're treated? Like a criminal?" David sighed, leaning back against the couch, his eyes closing for a moment as he tried to gather his thoughts. "It's not about what I've done, Cynthia. It's about what I look like. To some people, that's all that matters." Cynthia was quiet for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "What are we supposed to do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "How do we keep going when things like this keep happening? When you can't even drive home from the store without being treated like a suspect?" David opened his eyes, looking at his wife's tear-streaked face. He didn't have the answers. He wished he did. But this was the reality they had been living in for so long. A reality where no amount of success or respect could shield them from the biases and prejudices that existed in society. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I do know that we can't stop. We can't let this break us." Cynthia nodded, though her eyes still brimmed with anger. She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm so tired of this," she whispered. "I'm tired of being afraid for you, for our children. I'm tired of worrying every time you leave the house." David wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I know," he said softly. "I know. They sat in silence for a long while, the weight of the night settling over them like a heavy blanket. David could feel the tension in Cynthia's body, the way her breathing had quickened, the way her fingers dug into his arm, as though she were holding on for dear life. He understood her fear because he felt it too, but fear was something he had learned to live with, to navigate through. "I'll handle this," David finally said, his voice steady with determination. "I'll make sure this doesn't just get swept under the rug. Officer Winters is going to be held accountable." Cynthia lifted her head, her eyes searching his face. "Do you think they'll really do anything about it?" David paused before answering. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm going to make sure they try." The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the passage of time, as they both sat there in the quiet of their home, processing the reality of what had just happened. They had always known that the fight for justice was far from over, but tonight had reminded them of just how personal that fight was. David knew that this wasn't just about him. It was about his family, his community, and every black person in this country who had been treated as less than human. This wasn't a battle he could afford to walk away from, no matter how exhausting it was. As the night stretched on and the exhaustion began to settle into his bones, David knew one thing for certain: this fight was only beginning, and he was ready to face whatever came next. David woke up the next morning feeling the weight of the previous night hanging over him like a thick fog. He lay in bed for a few moments, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the soft sounds of Cynthia moving around downstairs. The house was quiet, peaceful even, but his mind was anything but. He felt a strange mix of anger, frustration, and determination swirling inside him, battling for dominance. The events with Officer Winters kept replaying in his head, each detail sharper and more painful than the last. The disrespect, the cold assumption that he was a threat just because of his skin color, the handcuffs that had bound his wrists, all of it left a bitter taste in his mouth. But beneath the anger, there was something else, something more powerful that was beginning to take root. Resolve. David had faced challenges before, many far greater than this. He had led men into battle, made life-or-death decisions, and survived the darkest moments of war. This fight, though different, was no less significant. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The early morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Cynthia had left a note on the nightstand, her neat handwriting a small comfort in the midst of his turmoil. "Went to run some errands. I'll be back soon. Love you." He smiled faintly, folding the note and tucking it into his pocket. Cynthia always knew how to keep things grounded, even in the most difficult times. As he dressed, his mind wandered back to the conversation they'd had the night before. Cynthia's fear, her frustration, had mirrored his own, but there had been a clarity in her words, a stark reminder that this wasn't just about him. It was about their children, about the future they were trying to build in a world that still treated them as second-class citizens. He made his way downstairs, his footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. The house was still quiet, but it felt less like a sanctuary than it had before. His thoughts drifted to his children. James and Maya were both at school, unaware of what had happened the night before. He wondered how long they could remain blissfully ignorant of the harsh realities of the world outside. They were still young, still full of hope and ambition. But how long would it be before the world tried to strip that away from them? David made himself a cup of coffee, the familiar routine offering a small sense of normalcy. He stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the backyard where the kids used to play when they were little. The swing set was still there, rusting slightly, but the memories of their laughter and joy were as vivid as ever. He wanted to protect that innocence, to shield them from the ugliness of the world. But he knew that was impossible. The best he could do was prepare them, teach them to stand tall, to fight back against the injustice they were bound to face. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it, half expecting a message from Cynthia. But instead, it was a notification from a local news app. The headline caught his attention immediately. Incident involving decorated Army General sparks outrage in small town. David frowned, his chest tightening. He hadn't expected the story to break so quickly. but he should have known better. In the age of smartphones and social media, nothing stayed under wraps for long. He clicked on the link, and the article opened with a bolded paragraph describing the confrontation between him and Officer Winters. There were already comments flooding in, some in support, others filled with vitriol and skepticism. The sight of it all, the words, the assumptions, the speculation, made David's stomach turn. He scrolled through the article, reading the details, some of which were accurate and others grossly exaggerated. His name was there in black and white. But it wasn't just him being dragged into the spotlight. The article had a life of its own now, a narrative being shaped by people who had no idea what the truth really was. His fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to respond to the comments, to set the record straight. But he knew it was a losing battle. The court of public opinion was often harsh and unforgiving. And once a story like this gained traction, it was hard to control. He took a deep breath, setting the phone down on the counter, and ran a hand through his hair. This was just the beginning, and he needed to be prepared for what came next. Just then, the doorbell rang, pulling David from his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone, and for a brief moment, his heart raced, wondering if it could be Officer Winters or someone from the police department coming to follow up. But as he walked to the door and opened it, he was met with the sight of Officer Jennifer Hayes standing on his porch, her expression a mix of professionalism and sympathy. "General Walker," she said, her voice calm but with an undertone of urgency. "I hope I'm not intruding." David shook his head, stepping aside to let her in. "Not at all. Officer Hayes, please, come in." She stepped inside, glancing around the living room before turning her attention back to him. "I came by because I wanted to make sure you're okay. After everything that happened last night, I thought it was important to check in with you personally." David nodded, appreciating the gesture, though he wasn't quite sure what to say. He had expected to hear from the police, but not like this. "I'm doing as well as can be expected, I suppose," he replied, motioning for her to sit down. It was a lot to take in. Officer Hayes sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped in front of her as she spoke. "I know, and I want you to know that what happened last night wasn't right. I've already filed my report with the department, and I'm pushing for an investigation into Officer Winters' conduct." David raised an eyebrow, surprised by her directness. "An investigation?" She nodded, her expression firm. "Yes, Winters acted out of line, and I'm not going to let that slide. The way he treated you is unacceptable, and he needs to be held accountable." David sat down across from her, his mind racing. Part of him had expected this, but hearing it from someone within the department made it feel more real. "Do you think they'll actually follow through?" he asked, his voice filled with skepticism. "Because I've heard promises like that before, and they don't always lead to change." Officer Hayes met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "I can't guarantee what the outcome will be," she said honestly, "but I can promise you that I won't stop pushing until something is done. I've seen too many cases like this go unpunished, and I refuse to let that happen again." Her words gave David a small glimmer of hope, though he knew there were no guarantees in situations like these. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I appreciate that more than you know." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging heavy in the air. Officer Hayes broke the silence first, her voice soft but sincere. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. General Walker, you deserve better." David smiled faintly, though the sadness in his eyes was still there. "I'm not the only one," he said. "There are too many people who have been treated the same way, if not worse. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us." Officer Hayes nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "You're right," she said softly, "and that's why we have to keep fighting." As she stood to leave, David felt a sense of gratitude for her presence, for her willingness to stand up against the injustice he had faced. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and in a world where progress often felt slow and elusive, that was something to hold on to. "Thank you again," David said as he walked her to the door. Officer Hayes turned back to him, offering a small but genuine smile. "You're welcome, General Walker, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." With that, she left, leaving David standing in the doorway. The weight of the night still heavy on his shoulders, but tempered by a small flicker of hope. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. But for the first time since the incident, he felt like he wasn't alone in the fight. As the door clicked shut behind him, David stood there for a moment longer, his thoughts once again turning to the future, not just for himself, but for his family, for his community, and for all those who had been silenced for too long. The fight for justice was far from over, but David was ready to keep moving forward. One step at a time, David spent the rest of the day lost in his thoughts. The conversation with Officer Hayes had left him with a strange mix of emotions. Hope, yes, but also a deep sense of frustration. He knew all too well how the system worked, how promises of investigations and change often fizzled out once the media attention faded. But there was something different this time. The fact that Hayes had come to him personally, had shown genuine empathy and determination, gave him a small glimmer of faith in the process. Still, the cynicism was hard to shake. He had seen too many people like him treated unjustly, only to watch the offenders walk away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. It was one thing for Officer Hayes to promise change, but it was another for the department or the public to actually demand it. That skepticism weighed heavily on his mind as the hours dragged on, and by the time Cynthia returned home, he was wound tight with anxiety. Cynthia entered the house quietly, her usual warm smile tempered by concern. David had texted her earlier, letting her know about Officer Hayes' visit, and she could tell from his messages that he was still struggling to process everything. She walked over to him and wrapped her arms around him in a tight embrace, her head resting gently against his chest. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly. David sighed, his hands resting on her back as he hugged her close. "I'm all right, I guess. I just can't stop thinking about it all. What happened? The investigation. The way things seem to go in these situations." Cynthia pulled back slightly, looking up at him with a serious expression. "I get it, David. I really do. But I think we need to take this one step at a time." Officer Hayes seemed like she was genuinely on our side. And that's something. It's not everything, but it's a start. David nodded, though the weight in his chest didn't lessen. "I know. I don't want to get my hopes up, only to be disappointed again. We've seen this before, haven't we? Good intentions aren't enough." Cynthia took his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "You're right, but good intentions are still better than nothing. We have to believe that change is possible. Otherwise, what's the point?" He looked down at her, taking in the strength and resolve in her eyes. Cynthia had always been the optimistic one, the one who could see the silver lining even in the darkest of clouds. He admired that about her, even if he found it harder to adopt that perspective himself. She was right, though. He couldn't afford to lose hope, not just for himself, but for his children, for his community. "I'll try," David said quietly, his voice tinged with the effort of keeping his doubt at bay. They stood in the kitchen for a moment longer, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Cynthia reached up and kissed him softly on the cheek. "That's all we can do, David. Try." Later that evening, as the sun set and the house settled into its usual quiet rhythm, David found himself sitting at the dining room table with his laptop open in front of him. He hadn't planned on doing anything in particular, but his mind wouldn't rest, and he needed something to occupy his hands while his thoughts continued to race. He scrolled through the news, his eyes catching on headlines that seemed to blur together: protests, police brutality, investigations, more protests. It was the same cycle over and over again. He had seen reports of protests beginning to form in his own town. After the incident with Officer Winters, word had spread quickly, and local activists had seized on the story as another rallying point in the ongoing fight against police violence. David wasn't surprised. His own case fit too perfectly into the broader narrative of systemic injustice. But as much as he supported the cause, the thought of his name being used as a symbol in this way made him uneasy. It wasn't that he didn't want change. He wanted it desperately. But the idea of becoming the face of something so large, so consuming, was overwhelming. David had spent his life serving quietly, making his mark in the military where he could lead without drawing too much attention to himself. Now, whether he liked it or not, he was being thrust into the spotlight, and the weight of that responsibility was almost too much to bear. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen to see a message from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years, but who had heard about what had happened and wanted to offer his support. David stared at the message for a long moment before replying with a simple, "Thanks." He appreciated the outreach, but every reminder of the incident felt like another weight pressing down on his chest. As he put his phone down, David's thoughts drifted back to his children. James and Maya hadn't been home when everything happened, and he and Cynthia hadn't had the chance to tell them the full story yet. But they would find out soon enough. The incident was already making waves in the community, and it was only a matter of time before they heard about it at school or through social media. David dreaded that conversation. He didn't want his children to carry the same fear and anger he had. He wanted them to be aware, of course, but he also wanted them to hold on to their sense of hope and possibility for as long as they could. But how could he balance that when the world was so clearly stacked against them? The door creaked open, and David looked up to see James walking into the room, his face serious and contemplative. "Hey, Dad," James said, his voice softer than usual. "Hey, kiddo," David replied, closing his laptop and turning to face his son. "Everything okay?" James hesitated for a moment, then sat down at the table across from his father. I heard something at school today. About you. Is it true?" David's heart sank. This was the moment he had been dreading. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. "Yeah, James. It's true." James looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the lines of the wood grain on the table. "Why didn't you tell me? I had to hear it from other kids." "I'm sorry," David said quietly. "We were going to tell you, but it all happened so fast. And your mom and I wanted to figure out how to talk to you about it first." James didn't say anything for a moment, but when he looked up, his eyes were filled with a mix of confusion and anger. "How could they do that to you? Dad, you're a general. You've done everything right your whole life. Why would they treat you like that?" David felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that always came when he saw the world through his son's eyes. James was only 16. Still on the cusp of adulthood, but not yet jaded by the harsh realities of life. He had grown up believing that if you worked hard and followed the rules, things would turn out okay. And now, David had to shatter that illusion. Sometimes it doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. "James," David said gently, "sometimes people see only what they want to see, and they make judgments based on things that have nothing to do with who you really are." James clenched his fists, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "That's not fair." "No, it's not," David agreed, his voice soft. "But it's the reality we live in, and that's why we have to keep fighting to change it." James looked at his father, searching his face for answers. "How do we fight, Dad? What do we do?" David smiled, though the sadness in his eyes remained. "We fight by standing up for what's right, by speaking out when we see injustice, and by never letting them make us feel like we're less than anyone else." James nodded slowly, the weight of his father's words settling over him. "I'll fight, too," he said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes." David reached across the table, placing a hand on his son's. "I know you will. James, I know you will." As the night wore on and the house grew still once again, David sat in the quiet, feeling the gravity of everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come. The fight for justice was far from over. But in that moment, surrounded by his family, he knew he wouldn't be fighting alone. David woke up the next morning feeling restless. The conversation with James the night before had lingered in his mind, weighing him down with the realization of how much his children would have to carry in the world. He knew he had to find a way to guide them through the challenges ahead. But it was difficult when he still hadn't fully come to terms with what had happened to him. The anger, the humiliation, it simmered just beneath the surface. A constant reminder of how the world could change in an instant, no matter who you were. Cynthia had already left for work by the time David made his way downstairs. The house was quiet, save for the sound of birds chirping outside the window. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the backyard. The calm of the suburban morning was a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside him. For a moment, he let himself imagine that nothing had changed, that life was as it had always been, peaceful and predictable. But reality had a way of crashing back in. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Officer Hayes, checking in to let him know that the investigation into Officer Winters was officially underway. David's hand hovered over the screen for a moment before he picked it up, his thumb hesitating over the reply button. What was there to say? He appreciated her efforts, but the investigation felt like a formality, something done to placate the public until the noise died down. Still, Hayes had shown herself to be different from the others. She had come to his home, had made an effort to connect with him on a personal level. That alone was enough for David to offer her the benefit of the doubt. At least for now. He typed out a quick response, thanking her for the update, and then set the phone down again. The minutes ticked by as he sipped his coffee, his mind drifting to the protests he had seen online. People had gathered outside the police station, demanding justice not just for him, but for all the others who had suffered similar fates. The footage was powerful, people of all races and backgrounds coming together with signs, chants, and a collective call for change. It was strange, seeing his name tied to something so much bigger than himself. He had never sought the spotlight, had never imagined that his life would become a symbol for a larger movement. But now that it had, he felt a sense of responsibility to do something with it. Staying silent wasn't an option anymore. Just as David was about to head upstairs to get ready for the day, the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone, and a brief flash of unease crossed his mind. He walked cautiously to the front door, peeking through the window before opening it. Standing on his porch was a familiar face, one he hadn't seen in years. "Jerome," David said, opening the door wider. "What are you doing here?" Jerome Richards, one of David's oldest friends from his time in the military, stood with a serious expression on his face. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his presence commanding even in casual clothes. But today, there was a heaviness in his eyes, as if he had come bearing the weight of the world. "I had to see you, man," Jerome said, stepping inside. "I saw the news. I saw everything." David closed the door behind him, unsure of what to say. He hadn't spoken to Jerome in years, not out of any animosity, but simply because life had taken them in different directions after they left the service. Now, seeing him here, David felt both comforted and unsettled by the sudden reminder of their shared past. "Come on in," David said, leading him into the living room. "I wasn't expecting you." Jerome nodded, glancing around the house as they sat down. "Yeah, I wasn't sure if I'd show up, to be honest. But after everything that's happened, I couldn't just sit back and watch from a distance." David leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "You've seen the videos, I assume." Jerome let out a low sigh, shaking his head. "I saw them, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing." "You're a damn general, David. How could something like that happen to you?" David's lips tightened, the frustration rising again. "It doesn't matter who I am, Jerome. That's the problem. They didn't see a general. They didn't see a man who's given his life to this country. They saw a black man, and that was enough." Jerome's face darkened, his jaw clenching in silent agreement. "It's not right. It's not right. And it makes me sick. That could have been any of us." David nodded, his gaze distant as he stared out the window. "Exactly. That's what I've been trying to explain to James. He's young. He doesn't understand how the world works yet. He's angry, but he doesn't realize that this is the reality we've always had to live with." Jerome leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "So, what are you going to do?" "I know you, David. You're not one to just let this slide." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Jerome. I've been thinking about it nonstop. About people protesting in my name, demanding justice. And all I want to do is protect my family from all of this. But I also know I can't stay silent. If I don't speak up now, what kind of example am I setting for my kids? For everyone who's looking to me for guidance?" Jerome was quiet for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. You're right, but you also have to take care of yourself. David, this isn't just about one moment. This is about something much bigger, and it's going to take a toll on you if you're not careful. David glanced at him, appreciating the concern in his friend's voice. I know, but it's not just about me anymore. Jerome nodded, leaning back in his chair. Well, whatever you decide, you know I've got your back. You're not in this alone. The two men sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything that had happened hanging heavy in the air. Jerome's presence was a comfort, a reminder of the brotherhood they had shared in the military, but it also brought a sense of urgency. David knew he couldn't avoid the inevitable confrontation with the public for much longer. I'm thinking of holding a press conference, David said finally, his voice quiet but steady. Not because I want to, but because I feel like I have to. People need to hear from me. Jerome raised an eyebrow. You sure you're ready for that? It's not going to be easy. David sighed. I don't know if I'm ready, but I can't keep hiding. If I don't say something, the narrative will get away from me, and I won't let them define me like that. Jerome nodded slowly. All right, if that's what you're going to do, I'll be there with you. Just say the word. David gave him a small, grateful smile. Thanks, Jerome. I appreciate it. As the afternoon wore on, the two men talked about old times, reminiscing about their days in the military, the missions they had completed, and the friends they had lost along the way. It was a welcome distraction from the storm that had been brewing in David's life, a reminder that he wasn't defined by this one moment of injustice. But as the sun began to set and Jerome prepared to leave, the reality of what lay ahead settled back into David's mind. He watched his friend drive away, the sense of isolation creeping in once more. The press conference loomed large in his thoughts, a daunting challenge he knew he couldn't avoid much longer. He would have to stand before the world and tell his story, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced by the system. And as he stood in the doorway, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky, David knew that the fight was only just beginning. David stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie. The day had finally arrived, and he was going to speak. The press conference had been announced, and soon, the world would hear from him for the first time since the incident that had changed everything. His reflection stared back at him, solemn and steady, but there was a tension in his shoulders that betrayed his calm exterior. Cynthia appeared behind him, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. You look good, she said softly, her voice offering the quiet support he had come to rely on. David turned slightly to meet her gaze in the mirror, giving her a small smile. I don't know if I'm ready for this, he admitted. The weight of his words hung heavy between them. She tilted her head, studying him. You've been ready, David. You've been ready your whole life. This is just another battle. And like always, you'll get through it. David appreciated her confidence. Even if he wasn't sure, he felt it himself. The press conference wasn't just about the events of that night. It was about something much larger than him, about justice, about systemic racism, about every other person who had been unfairly treated by those in power. I hope you're right, David said, turning to face her fully. Because this isn't just about me. People are expecting a lot from me. They're looking to me for answers. And I'm not sure I have all of them. Cynthia's hand slid down to his, squeezing it tightly. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to speak your truth. That's all anyone can ask. David nodded, feeling the warmth of her hand in his. For a moment, he allowed himself to take comfort in that, to lean on her strength. I'll try. That's all I can do. The drive to the community center where the press conference was being held was quiet, the streets lined with people holding signs of support. As they passed, David noticed a mixture of faces: black, white, young, old, people from all walks of life who had gathered to show solidarity. It was heartening, but also intimidating. The enormity of the movement that had grown in the wake of his arrest was far beyond anything he had ever anticipated. What had started as a single, unjust moment had ballooned into a national outcry for reform. And somehow, he had become the face of that cause. When they arrived, the parking lot was already filled with cars. Media trucks with satellite dishes perched on top lined the street. Cameras set up on tripods outside the building's entrance. Reporters milled around, microphones in hand, ready to broadcast his words to the world. The sight of it all made David's heart race. Cynthia squeezed his hand again as they walked toward the building. "Remember, you're not alone in this," she whispered. "We're all behind you." David nodded, but the nerves were undeniable. Stepping into the community center felt like stepping onto a battlefield, not one marked by physical danger, but one where words and perception could be just as impactful. As they walked inside, a hush fell over the crowd that had gathered. Jerome was waiting for him in the lobby, dressed sharply in a dark suit. He nodded as David approached, his expression calm but resolute. "You ready?" Jerome asked, his tone more supportive than questioning. "As ready as I'll ever be," David replied, exhaling deeply. The two men exchanged a firm handshake, a silent understanding passing between them. A woman from the community center staff approached, gesturing toward the back entrance that led to the stage outside. "We're ready for you, General Walker," she said, her voice tinged with respect and awe. David followed her, his mind swirling with everything he wanted to say, everything he knew he needed to address. The crowd outside was already restless, their voices a low murmur of anticipation. He could hear the hum of the reporters, the clicking of cameras as they prepared to broadcast his every word. The doors opened, and the sunlight hit David's face as he stepped out onto the stage. The crowd erupted into applause, the noise almost overwhelming. Signs waved in the air, some reading justice for General Walker, others calling for police reform, for an end to systemic racism. The energy in the air was electric, the weight of their expectations palpable. David approached the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. As he stood there, looking out over the sea of faces, he realized just how many people had been affected by what had happened to him. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about a system that had been broken for far too long. And now, the world was watching, waiting for him to speak. He cleared his throat, the microphone amplifying the sound across the open space. The crowd quieted, their eyes fixed on him, their expressions a mixture of hope and determination. For a moment, David hesitated, unsure of where to begin. But then he thought of James, of Maya, of Cynthia, and of everyone else who had ever been silenced by the system. This was bigger than him. This was for all of them. "I want to thank you all for being here today," David began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I stand before you not just as a man, not just as a father, not just as a husband, but as someone who has experienced firsthand the injustice that too many people in this country have faced for far too long." The crowd murmured in agreement, the intensity of their emotions mirrored in their faces. David took a deep breath, continuing, "What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It was not just about one bad officer making a mistake. It was about a system that allows people like Officer Winters to believe that they can act without consequence. It was about a system that has, for generations, dehumanized and marginalized people of color. And I'm here today to say that enough is enough." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in support. David paused, letting the noise wash over him before speaking again. "For too long, we have been told to wait for change. We've been told to be patient, to trust that the system will correct itself. But how much longer can we wait? How many more lives have to be destroyed before we see real reform? I'm here today because I refuse to be silent any longer. I refuse to let my children grow up in a world where they have to live in fear because of the color of their skin." Tears welled up in David's eyes as he spoke, the weight of his words hitting him harder than he had expected. He glanced out at the crowd, seeing the pain and the determination in their faces, and he knew that they felt the same way. This wasn't just about him. This was about all of them. "I'm calling for accountability," David continued, his voice growing stronger. "I am calling for justice, and I am calling for real, meaningful change, because we cannot go on like this. We cannot continue to allow a system that was built on prejudice and fear to dictate the lives of our children, our brothers and sisters, our friends and neighbors." The crowd erupted again, their cheers filling the air with a sense of urgency and hope. David took a moment to collect himself, his heart pounding with the intensity of the moment. "I may be one man, but I am not alone," David said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We are all in this together, and together, we can create a better world. A world where justice is not a privilege, but a right for everyone." As David stepped back from the podium, the crowd's applause reached a deafening roar. He felt a surge of emotion rise within him: relief, pride, and the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. But for the first time, David felt like he was truly a part of something bigger than himself. And as he walked off the stage, Cynthia met him with open arms, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You did it," she whispered in his ear. "You were incredible." David nodded, his heart full as he looked out over the crowd one last time. The battle for justice had just begun, and he was ready to lead it. David sat down in the small, quiet room in the community center after his speech, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. His body still hummed with the adrenaline from the stage. And though he had delivered countless briefings and talks during his military career, this moment felt more personal, more profound than any before. Cynthia was beside him, her hand resting on his knee, grounding him in the present. The crowd outside had begun to disperse, but the energy from the event was still palpable. He knew that this was only the beginning. His speech had been a rallying cry, but now the hard work of translating words into action was ahead of them. Jerome entered the room, his expression as calm as ever, though David could see the flicker of pride in his eyes. He sat across from David, leaning back in his chair with a slow exhale. "You did good out there, David. People were listening," Jerome said, nodding slightly as if confirming his own assessment. David gave a tired smile. "I hope so, but you know as well as I do that speeches only go so far. We have to keep the momentum going." Jerome tilted his head in agreement. "That's why we got to make sure we're organized. The pressure is on, and people will be looking for leadership. There's a lot of talk, but not enough action yet. That's where you come in." David frowned, leaning forward slightly. "What do you mean? You're the one who's been organizing all this." "I'm just one voice." "You're not just one voice," Jerome replied, his tone more serious now. "You're the voice. People don't rally like this for just anyone. They're here because they see you as someone who can lead them, whether you like it or not. You're the face of this movement now." The weight of Jerome's words settled over David, and for a moment, he felt the pressure of responsibility bearing down on him. He had wanted to speak out, to call for justice and accountability, but he hadn't fully anticipated being thrust into the role of a leader beyond his speech. "I never asked for this, Jerome," David said, his voice quiet. "I don't know if I'm the right person for the job." Jerome's eyes softened, and he leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "No one ever asks for it, and no one ever feels ready for it. But that doesn't change the fact that you are the right person. You got the experience, the integrity, and the story that people can rally behind. They need someone who's been through it, who knows what it's like to face injustice and come out the other side. That's you, David." David ran a hand over his face, feeling the exhaustion settle in. He knew Jerome was right. He had seen it in the crowd's eyes, the hope, the belief that he could be the one to help bring about real change. But the enormity of it all still felt overwhelming. I'm tired," David admitted, his voice raw. "I thought my fight was over when I left the military. I didn't expect to come home and face another battle." Cynthia squeezed his hand, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not in this alone, David. We're all here with you. You've spent your life leading people in the military, and now you're leading people in a different kind of fight. But it's still about the same thing, doing what's right." David looked at her, appreciating her unwavering support, and then turned his gaze back to Jerome. "What's the next step, then? How do we turn all of this into something real, something lasting?" Jerome smiled faintly, sensing David's shift in focus. "We start small, but we build something solid. We push for reforms locally, police accountability boards, better training, real consequences for misconduct. We get the community involved in every step of the process. So it's not just us versus them. It's all of us together. David nodded slowly, letting Jerome's words sink in. We've got to make sure this doesn't fade away. Like so many movements before, people get fired up. They march. They protest. But then it dies down, and nothing changes. That's why we need to stay organized. Jerome agreed. Keep the pressure on. Keep the dialogue going. And we can't just rely on protests. We need to get people in positions where they can make decisions, city councils, police oversight committees, even the mayor's office. Real change starts when we have a seat at the table. David listened, the gears in his mind beginning to turn. He could see the path forward, though it was still shrouded in uncertainty. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and it would take time, probably more time than most were willing to admit. But it was a road worth walking. As he sat there, mulling over the next steps, there was a soft knock on the door. A staff member poked her head in, her expression hesitant. General Walker? Officer Winters is here. David's stomach tightened at the mention of Winters. He hadn't seen the man since that fateful night, and part of him wasn't sure he wanted to. There was still so much anger and frustration bottled up inside him, emotions he wasn't ready to face head-on. Cynthia looked at him, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you okay with that?" she asked softly, reading the tension in his posture. David took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Yeah, I need to face him at some point. Might as well do it now." Jerome stood up, his expression unreadable. "I'll give you some space, but I'll be right outside if you need me." David nodded, and Jerome left the room, leaving him and Cynthia alone for a moment. She gave him a reassuring smile, but David could see the worry in her eyes. "It's going to be okay," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. "You don't owe him anything, but maybe talking to him will give you some peace." David didn't reply right away, but he squeezed her hand in silent thanks before standing up and walking toward the door. As he opened it, he saw Officer Winters standing in the hallway, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn and pale. The man who had once been so filled with arrogance and bravado now looked broken, humbled by the weight of his actions and the consequences that had followed. Winters glanced up as David approached, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and regret. "General Walker," Winters said quietly, his voice strained. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." David regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Let's talk," he said simply, motioning for Winters to follow him back into the room. Once inside, David gestured for Winters to sit down, and the officer did so, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were afraid of making any sudden gestures. David sat across from him, his hands resting on the table between them, his gaze unwavering. For a few moments, neither man spoke. The silence stretched, thick with tension and unspoken words. Winters fidgeted nervously, clearly unsure of how to begin. "I don't know where to start," Winters finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to figure out what to say, how to explain, but there's no excuse for what I did. I'm sorry. Truly." David remained silent, his expression impassive as Winters spoke. He could see the guilt and regret in the man's eyes, but he wasn't ready to offer forgiveness, not yet. "Sorry isn't enough," David said finally, his voice measured. "What happened that night, it wasn't just about you making a mistake. It was about a system that allowed you to think it was okay to treat me like that. And it's not just me. It's people like me, people who look like me, who deal with this every day." Winters nodded, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I know," he whispered. "I know. And I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to be better. I want to make it right." David's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "You can't make it right, Winters. What you can do is make sure it doesn't happen again. To anyone." Winters looked up, meeting David's eyes with a mixture of hope and desperation. "I want to. I don't know how, but I want to. I need to." David leaned back in his chair, studying Winters carefully. He could see that the man was sincere, that the weight of his actions had taken a toll on him. But sincerity wasn't enough to undo the damage that had been done. It wasn't enough to fix a broken system. I'll tell you what you can do. David said quietly. You can start by holding yourself accountable. You can start by speaking up when you see this kind of thing happening. You can start by standing with us, not against us. Winters nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I will, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I will. David stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. This is a long road. Winters, it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. But if you're serious about making things right, you'll walk it. Winters stood as well, his posture tense but determined. I will, he repeated. I promise. David watched as Winters left the room, the door closing softly behind him. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, his mind heavy with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come. Cynthia appeared beside him, her presence a steadying force. How do you feel? She asked softly. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, he admitted, but I think it's a start. She nodded, her hand slipping into his. That's all we can ask for. Together, they stood in the quiet room, the weight of the world outside pressing in, but knowing that they weren't facing it alone. David stood in the hallway, watching the door close behind Officer Winters. His mind felt heavy with the intensity of the encounter, the unspoken emotions lingering in the air. There was a small sense of closure in confronting Winters, but it wasn't the kind of closure that made everything right. No single conversation could do that, but it was a beginning, a step toward a different future. He hoped Winters would follow through on his words, but David knew that talk was easy. Change, real change, required time and action. Cynthia squeezed his hand again, pulling him gently from his thoughts. Let's go home, she said softly, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. You've done enough for today. David nodded, grateful for her steadiness. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The events of the past days had been a whirlwind of speeches, interviews, and difficult conversations. And while he knew that there was more work to be done, he also understood that he needed to recharge. His family was waiting, and their presence was the one thing that could anchor him through this storm. As they made their way to the car, the evening sky had turned a deep shade of blue, the sun having long set behind the trees. The streets were quieter now, the last remnants of protesters beginning to disperse. David and Cynthia walked in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that came from years of shared understanding. When they reached the car, David paused for a moment, his hand resting on the door handle. He looked back at the community center, its simple brick facade bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. This place had become a hub of activity, a gathering point for those who sought change. It felt strange to think how quickly his life had shifted. Just weeks ago, he had been focused on settling back into civilian life, spending time with his family, and leaving his military career behind. Now, he was thrust into a different kind of battle, one that would require every ounce of his leadership, determination, and resilience. Are you okay? Cynthia asked, her voice gentle but probing. David gave her a small smile, opening the car door. I think so. It's just a lot to take in, but I'll be okay. They both got into the car, the soft hum of the engine breaking the silence as they pulled away from the curb. As they drove through the quiet streets, David's mind drifted back to the conversation with Winters. He couldn't shake the image of the man's defeated posture, the way his voice had cracked with emotion. Winters had seemed sincere, but David couldn't help but wonder whether that sincerity would translate into action. He had seen too many promises made and too many promises broken in his lifetime. Words were easy, but actions, those were what mattered. They drove in silence for a while, the familiar roads leading them home. The quiet of the suburban streets felt like a stark contrast to the noise and energy of the protest earlier. David glanced out the window, watching as the streetlights flickered past, his thoughts still heavy. When they arrived at home, the porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the front yard. David parked the car and sat for a moment, feeling the weight of the day settle over him. Cynthia reached over, resting her hand on his arm. Take a breath, she said softly. We're home now. David nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping out of the car. The familiar sounds of their neighborhood greeted him: crickets chirping, the distant hum of a lawnmower, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was a peaceful, almost idyllic setting, a sharp contrast to the tension and chaos that had dominated his life recently. As they walked up the steps to the front door, the sound of laughter reached them from inside the house. David smiled at the sound of his children's voices, the warmth of their presence tugging at the corners of his heart. No matter how difficult the outside world became, this, his family, was what truly mattered. Cynthia opened the door, and they stepped inside to find James and Maya sitting on the couch, engrossed in a video game. James, with his lanky frame and teenage awkwardness, was focused intently on the screen, while Maya, smaller and more energetic, bounced excitedly beside him, cheering him on. "Hey, you too," David said, his voice filled with affection. James looked up and grinned. "Dad, you're home." Maya immediately jumped up and ran over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "We missed you," David chuckled, ruffling her hair. "I missed you too, kiddo." Cynthia smiled warmly as she watched them, her eyes filled with love. "Why don't you all sit down? I'll make some tea." David nodded gratefully and sat down on the couch, pulling Maya into his lap. James plopped down beside him, his eyes still darting between the game on the screen and his father. For a few minutes, they all just sat together, the comfort of home wrapping around David like a blanket. "How was it, Dad?" James asked after a while, his tone more serious now. "Did everything go okay at the protest?" David sighed, leaning back against the cushions. "It was intense, but good. People are paying attention, and that's what matters. We're starting something important." Maya looked up at him, her big eyes filled with curiosity. "Are you going to be on TV again?" David laughed softly. "Maybe, but I'd rather spend time with you guys than be on TV." Maya beamed at that, snuggling closer to him. James, though quieter, had a look of pride in his eyes, the same look he'd had ever since the protests had started. David could tell that his son admired him, that he saw his father as a hero not just for his military service, but for standing up against injustice. "Are you going to keep doing this, Dad?" James asked, his voice low. "The speeches, the protests, all of it." David paused, considering the question. "I think so, James. It's important. There's a lot of work to do, and I want to help make things better, but I'll always make time for you and your sister. That's never going to change." James nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm proud of you, Dad. I think what you're doing is really important." David felt a swell of emotion at his son's words, his heart full. He wrapped an arm around James, pulling him into a rare but heartfelt embrace. "Thanks, buddy. That means a lot to me." Cynthia returned with the tea, setting the tray down on the coffee table before sitting beside them. The four of them sat together, sipping tea, talking quietly, and enjoying the simple comfort of being home. The worries of the world seemed distant in that moment, replaced by the warmth of family and the familiar rhythm of life. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, David and Cynthia sat together on the back porch, the cool night air wrapping around them like a gentle embrace. The stars were out, twinkling above in the clear sky, and the sound of crickets filled the quiet. Cynthia leaned her head against David's shoulder, her hand resting on his. "I'm proud of you. You know." David smiled, his heart swelling at her words. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said softly. "You're the one who keeps me grounded." She laughed lightly. "That's my job. But seriously, David, you're doing something important. I know it's hard, and I know it's not what you expected, but you're making a difference." David sighed, looking out at the stars. "I hope so. It's just, sometimes it feels like it's never enough. You know? Like no matter how hard we fight, the system just keeps going." Cynthia squeezed his hand. "I know, but even small steps can lead to big changes. You're not alone in this, and you're not carrying the weight of the world by yourself." He nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Thank you, Cynthia, for everything." She smiled, her eyes filled with love. Always. As they sat together under the stars, the world felt a little less heavy. David knew that the fight was far from over. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to rest, knowing that with his family by his side, he could face whatever came next. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful and emotional journey. We hope this story has moved you and sparked deeper thoughts on justice, resilience, and the human spirit. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more stories that matter. Stay tuned.